Imagine waking up before dawn in a mountain monastery, the air cool with mist, the smell of damp pine in your nostrils. Outside your cell, a group of monks walks barefoot down a winding path, not to pray, not to chant, but to glaze teacups, and they do it in complete silence. Welcome to Goryeo-era Korea, circa the 12th century, a time when pottery wasn't merely craft, it was contemplation. And the most revered of all ceramics was celadon, the cool green of foggy jade, formed by fire and patience, perfected by those who believed that beauty should never shout. Clay before words. The monks of Buseoksa Temple began each celadon-making day with a strange sort of reverence, not to a god or even a Buddha, but to the mud. The clay used for celadon, known as oedo, was not pulled from any random stream. It had to come from specific riverbeds near Ganjin. Its quality determined by the balance of iron and aluminum, not too gritty, not too slick, and always tested in silence. There was no yes or no in the workshop, only nods, shrugs, or a single tap on the wooden table, once for approval, twice for pause. A novice monk named Minji often found it difficult. He had come from a rice-farming family and was used to shouting at oxen and bickering with cousins. But here, in the monastery kiln, even a sneeze was cause for side-eye glances. Minji's master, the elderly monk Chansu, believed that even breath could spoil a glaze. "Speak," he once mouthed to Minji, "and the clay will forget its shape." Tools with no voices. The tools of the celadon workshop were as quiet as the monks themselves. There were no hammers or chisels, no loud wheels clattering like those in mainland China. Instead, they used hand-carved wooden paddles to shape the walls of vases and soft hemp cloths to smooth the surface. If they needed to cut, they used threads of horsehair, silent and exact. Glazing was a particularly delicate ritual. The glaze itself was a strange greenish-gray slop made of feldspar, ash, and traces of iron oxide. But the secret was in the air. Too humid, and the color dulled. Too dry, and the glaze cracked. So the monks watched clouds. They wet their fingers and held them to the wind. They sniffed the rain. Minji, the whisper of fire. The kiln, shaped like a long, low dome, dug into the mountainside, was known as a noborigama, or climbing kiln. Its multi-chambered interior allowed for different temperatures in each section, which meant that a single firing could produce varying shades of green, from misty sea foam to deep moss. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? A cold village? A quiet city? Somewhere with rain? I read every one of your stories, and they're part of the sleep ritual now. The celadon teacup that left the mountains in a modest cloth-wrapped box should not have drawn much attention. It bore no signature. It had no inlaid cranes, no gold rim, not even a carrying mark from the monastery, just a faint spiral at the base where Minji's thumb had spun the clay. The glaze was soft, a translucent green with a hint of blue, like morning dew on a bamboo leaf. But when the courier from Bureaucrat arrived at the Goryeo royal court in Gaesong, something odd happened. The cup did not vanish into the back rooms of tribute offerings. It did not disappear into the collection of minor artifacts stored in drawers beside incense holders and lacquer spoons. Instead, it was set upon the royal tea table by the king himself, and it rang. The king who listened to clay. King Injong of Goryeo, the 17th ruler in the dynasty, had a curious hobby. He collected silence. Not just quiet spaces, but quiet things. He once banned bronze chimes from his garden because they startled the butterflies. He had an entire wing of the palace devoted to whispering objects, shell inlays, silk screens, silent poetry. He even wrote his own poems with ink made from rainwater and crushed magnolia. When the teacup from Bureaucrat was placed before him, the king did not sip immediately. He tapped it with a bamboo spoon. The sound, a clear, low hum, lasted 3 seconds. He whispered, "This one has breath." His advisors didn't understand. They rarely did. But Injong, for all his eccentricity, had the power to declare tastes, and his tastes were changing. That week, he summoned the Royal Bureau of Kiln Affairs. Imperial Glaze Panic. The bureau, located just outside Gaesong, was filled with master potters who had studied under Chinese tutors and local experts alike. Their works were brilliant, elaborate, decorated with inlays, stamps, and brush-painted dragons. They expected their pieces to please, but when the royal order came, it confused them. Replicate the breadth of this cup. No dragons, no symmetry, no shine. The head potter, Zhou Guansik, examined the cup under oil lamps. He held it upside down, measured the curve of its lip, even sniffed the base for traces of pine ash. "Made in Gangjin, most likely," he said. "Soft firing, intentional glaze pooling, not impressive." But the king disagreed. He began replacing court serviceware with Bureaucrat celadon. He even issued the whisper of fire. The kiln, shaped like a long, low dome, dug into the mountainside, was known as a nobori-gama, or climbing kiln. Its multi-chambered interior allowed for different temperatures in each section, which meant that a single firing could produce varying shades of green, from misty sea foam to deep moss. The firing itself lasted 2 days and nights, with monks taking turns to feed the fire through tiny openings, using split pine wood. Not a word was spoken. Instead, they communicated with gestures. 3 fingers raised meant too hot. A palm to the ground meant let it settle. One mistake, and a month's worth of work would collapse into ash and bubbles. Minjae once nodded off during his night shift and woke to find Chansu staring into the flames, his face unreadable. He never scolded. He simply handed Minjae a cracked teacup from a previous failure. The cup was warped, its glaze riddled with pinholes. Chansu tapped it lightly against a stone. It did not ring. "Soundless," he mouthed. "Like your duty." Minjae never slept during a firing again. Chansu often traced his finger over them and smiled. Breath marks, he called them. Proof the clay once listened. Some pieces bore sangam inlays, delicate motifs carved and filled with white or black slip before the glaze, lotus flowers, cranes, bamboo leaves. But even these had to be subtle. No roaring dragons, no boasting plum blossoms. Just quiet symbols, meant for someone to notice after years of use. Minjay once asked on a rare speaking day why they never signed their work. Chansu replied, "A name adds noise." One winter, a cup fired by Minjay, a simple wide-mouthed vessel with a green that looked like forest fog, was selected to be sent to the royal court in Gaesong. The king was said to admire celadon more than gold. He held contests between potters. He composed poems to glaze colors. The monks did not celebrate. Minjay was not congratulated. Instead, Chansu gave him an older cup from a forgotten apprentice. It had a small crack beneath the rim. "Use this one now," he said. "The best ones leave us." And yet, how did one monk's whisper-quiet teacup end up influencing royal policy on ceramics? And what did it mean for Korea's most peaceful rebellion? The Whisper Campaign. Back at Bureaucrat, Minjay had no idea that his cup had started a movement. But small changes began to trickle in. A younger monk brought a scroll from Gaesong, a request from the court for 36 fog-glazed cups of contemplative form. Another arrived later that season. Vases with quiet bellies and introspective mouths. By the second year, Bureaucrat had to expand the kiln hours. Novice monks began being assigned to clay rotation before morning bell. Minjay was offered a formal title, Senior Kiln Brother, a role once reserved for monks with 10 years in silence. Master Chansu only nodded. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. Then, unexpectedly, a courier arrived, not with another order, but with a question. "What causes the spiral at the base of your cups?" Minjay stared at the note for a long time. He could not explain it in words. It was just the way his thumb moved when he finished smoothing the foot of the cup. He tried to write, "It is not made, it is left behind." The courier frowned. "The bureau wants diagrams." Chansu, seated nearby, shook his head. "Once they diagram silence," he muttered, "they'll break it." By the 1180s, the Gangjin Celadon kilns had changed entirely. They no longer followed strict Chinese models. The pieces became rounder, softer, more hesitant. Pottery was no longer just a merchant's good or a court's treasure. It became a philosophy. Some historians would later call this the Quiet Rebellion, though at the time it involved no shouting, no slogans, no official edicts, just monks, artisans, and a few royalty who decided that calm could shape clay better than ambition. The spiral at the base of Minjay's original cup became a sought-after feature. It wasn't until decades later that potters outside Bureaucrat learned it was unintentional. Even then, they copied it. Minjay never commented. He still sat each morning with a fresh batch of clay, listening to the wind. He still refused to speak during glaze preparation. He still used the old, cracked cup. Time passed and the quiet turned brittle. By the early 13th century, Korea found itself caught between reverence and rebellion. The kingdom of Goryeo faced mounting pressures from internal revolts, banditry, and the looming threat of Mongol invasion. The royal court, once enamored with teacups and temple aesthetics, began turning its attention toward armor and walls. Yet deep in the hills, the monks at Bureaucrat continued to fire their kilns. Minje, now a gray-haired monk with cracked knuckles and a permanent smudge of clay beneath his nails, worked more slowly. He spent long hours sorting through riverbed mud, selecting the finest grains by touch alone. And still, he rarely spoke. One spring, a storm swept through the mountains, cracking the roof tiles of the kiln shed and flooding the clay cellar. Several pots exploded during firing. Small imperfections, invisible in the wet clay, had widened with the heat. Minje sat beside the remains in silence, watching the glaze cool into fractured patterns. Perhaps, he thought, they are beautiful because they're failing. The glaze dim's courtly interest in Celadon began to wane. After King Injong's death, his successors grew more interested in flashy trade goods and bold statements. Pottery became heavier, glossier, louder. Dragons returned to teacups. Gold leaf curled around handles. Imported blue and white wares from China dazzled the markets of Gaesong. The monk-style Celadon, subtle, asymmetrical, fog-colored, was declared old-fashioned by the new potters of the capital. Several former admirers tried to replicate the Bureaucrat spiral, but added their own stamped signatures beneath it. At court banquets, guests sipped from cups that clanged, not rang. At Bureaucrat, Chonsu's kiln fell into disuse. It simply became too costly to keep wood flowing, too difficult to gather enough pure glaze ingredients as war threatened trade. Some of the monks were drafted into civil service, others fled the temple entirely. Minje remained, and in his final years, he stopped firing altogether. Instead, he taught one student at a time how to shape silence into form. Not with lectures, not with diagrams, but by placing clay in their hands and nodding when they got it right. The final cup. When Minje passed away, the temple records, such as they were, listed him simply as kiln brother, maker of the unnamed cup. There was no shrine, no statue, just one final piece placed at the foot of the monastery altar. A small Celadon cup, its lip uneven, its base bearing a faint spiral like the pattern of wind in sand. No one dared drink from it. The kiln remained unused for decades. Eventually, vines crept across its arch, and moss softened its once fiery mouth. A few traveling monks would pause there, sitting on its cool stone ledge, not knowing they were near the source of a royal obsession that had changed the tone of an entire art form. Centuries later, scholars and collectors would unearth Bureaucrat Celadon in burial mounds and storage cellars. They marveled at the glaze, puzzled over the spiral, and argued about why the pieces lacked decoration. But they all agreed on one thing: the cups were quiet. Legacy in clay. Today, if you visit a museum in Seoul or Tokyo, you might see one of Minjae's cups behind glass, catalogued as Goryeo Celadon, monk kiln type. It sits alone, often beside more glamorous vases with phoenix inlays and gilt dragons. People pass it by. But if you pause, lean close, you might notice that the base spirals just slightly, as if remembering the finger that once finished it. And if you're very quiet, you might imagine the fire that once breathed it into being, the mountain air, the silent monks, and a king who favored teacups over armies. Next time you drink tea, ask yourself, is your cup loud, or does it hold a quiet meant to be listened to? You wake before dawn. The town is still, wrapped in the blue silence of early morning. But somewhere nearby, the click of a loom is already sounding, gentle, rhythmic, constant. The sound is not urgent, yet it never stops. Tap, tap, click, slide, beat. It sounds like conversation. In the sun-baked towns of the ancient Mali Empire, this was the sound of memory being woven, long before Europeans wrote chronicles about great African kings, and centuries before modern historians tried to reconstruct West Africa's past using travelers' journals. The weavers of Mali were already recording history, row by row, in dyed cotton and wool, without writing a single word. The loom as library. In 14th century Mali, just outside cities like Djenné and Niani, weaving was more than a trade. It was a form of storytelling, a soft-spoken, color-coded way to record genealogies, victories, myths, and family lineages. The horizontal strip loom was the favored tool, used by specialized male weavers in towns and women in rural areas to produce narrow bands of cloth that were later stitched into broader garments or blankets. But these weren't just for covering bodies or beds. A patterned strip of cloth could signal which clan you belonged to, whether your family came from the north or south bank of the Niger, and even which ancestral figure you claimed descent from. For example, a series of alternating white and indigo triangles might signify an alliance between two trading villages. A narrow red band might refer to a harvest year remembered for a great flood. An off-center black diamond, a child born during an eclipse. All of it woven silently into the warp and weft, all of it lasting longer than speech. One of the most distinctive fabrics woven in the region was known among the Mande-speaking people as kokolabe, a cloth so densely patterned with meaning that elders sometimes refused to explain its symbols to outsiders. A piece might be worn only on ritual days, passed down from grandfather to grandson, and never washed in the river lest its story be washed away. There is one story, half legend, half footnote in a traveler's account, about a weaver named Makalo who lived near the town of Dia around 1330. He was known not for bright colors or intricate designs, but for his restraint, cloth that looked almost plain until you studied it in slanting light. Makala, the women who died time. While men in many Mande societies handled the weaving, women especially in towns like San and Segu, controlled the indigo vats. These vats, often as deep as a standing person's chest, were kept bubbling in shaded courtyards. The process was smelly, difficult, and required precise timing. A single misstep and the dye would turn dull or rot. But more than technique, the women held the power of color. A young girl learned to judge the right moment to lift cloth from the dye bath by watching the bubbles, not just with her eyes, but with her ears. She learned when the cloth was ready to remember. Once dyed, a strip of blue cloth might be used in a naming ceremony, then tucked away for a generation, only to reappear at the burial of the child who'd once been wrapped in it. The cloth remembered what people forgot. The cloth could also protest. In one account from the oral histories of the Bozo people, a woman deliberately dyed a funeral cloth the wrong shade of blue, too pale, like the sky before a drought. It was an insult, understood by everyone present. No one spoke of it, but the cloth had said what needed saying. Patterns without parchment. To an outsider, the weavings of medieval Mali might look merely decorative. Stripes, triangles, zigzags, but to those who knew, each twist and dye held meaning. A wide band flanked by two narrow ones, a symbol of an elder flanked by grandchildren. A crooked line through otherwise perfect geometry, a reminder of a lost harvest or a civil dispute. Some families even signed their textiles with distinctive flaws, on purpose, a dropped thread, a slightly skewed border, like a fingerprint, only visible to those trained to see. But this system of memory had its limits. What happened when the weaver died without passing along the code? What if no one recognized a particular pattern anymore? Some cloth simply faded into beauty, no longer stories, just decoration. Others were burned, or buried, or traded away. A piece of fabric, after all, could only carry meaning as long as someone remembered how to read it. So as you drift off tonight, consider this. How many stories lie folded in closets, mistaken for mere patterns? By the time of Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage in 1324, the reputation of Mali had spread across the Sahara. Gold traders from Taghaza, scholars from Timbuktu, and caravans from Cairo all intersected in towns where the cloth market rang with hushed bargaining and looms clicked steadily under shade canopies. Musa's gold, famously extravagant, caught the attention of the Mediterranean world. But for the families of the Niger River basin, it was often the cloth that carried more meaning, storing stories in silence, wrapping both joy and grief into the everyday act of getting dressed. A royal gift without words. There's a quiet tale, one recorded only in fragments by griots and family memory, about a cloth presented to Mansa Musa upon his return from Mecca. The king, weary from the weight of fame and ceremony, stopped in a village said to be near modern-day Mopti. There he was given no feast, no song. Instead, an elder presented him with a bolt of plain-looking indigo cloth, wrapped in goat hide. The king was puzzled, but the cloth, when unrolled, told a story that only someone raised along the Niger might understand. Each strip marked a phase of the kingdom's rise, a thread of river-green cotton from the early conquests, sections dyed with a now extinct indigo plant representing the reign of Musa's grandfather, and a repeating chevron that mirrored the constellations visible the night of his birth. Musa, it said, sat for a long time staring at it. And then he bowed, not to the elder, but to the cloth. He said only, "It has remembered more than I have." When cloth became protest. As Mali grew wealthier and its bureaucracy expanded, not all changes pleased the people. Grain taxes grew steeper. Arabic-speaking scribes trained in Islamic law began to replace local chiefs in disputes. Some clans lost their influence in court. They didn't write complaints, they wove them. In one village west of Niani, a new style emerged, bands of undyed cotton interrupted by sudden, erratic stitches in red. From afar, it looked simple, even clumsy, but up close, it appeared uneasy. The pattern spread quietly. Officials didn't understand it. Traders thought it a local fashion. But among weavers, the meaning was clear. A thread out of place, like a ruler uninvited. These protest cloths weren't burned. They weren't banned. They were too subtle. Instead, they were worn to festivals, baptisms, women who sang the loom. Outside of the major trade towns, women's weaving traditions continued uninterrupted. Though the horizontal loom remained in use among men in markets, many women used upright frame looms or hand-knotting techniques. These cloths, too, recorded memory. Only the symbols were more bodily. A circular knot at one corner might represent a successful birth after a difficult labor. A knotted fringe could indicate mourning. An uneven hem might recall a marriage that ended in divorce. And during the actual weaving, some women sang. Not lyrics, but wordless melodies that shifted slightly with each pass of the thread. The rhythm was recorded by the fingers, not the page. Over time, certain weaving songs became associated with particular stories. The daughter who ran away with the griot, the tree that bloomed during drought, the friend who never returned from the northern salt route. You didn't need to know the words, you just had to know how the song felt as the loom moved. Thread as time. A scholar named Jibril Diakite, writing centuries later, described this form of memory as suspended history. Stories paused in physical form, waiting for context to reawaken them. A cloth could be folded for 100 years, but when opened by the right hands, it resumed its story mid-thread. One famous piece, a funeral wrap from the early 1400s, was unearthed in a family chest in the 19th century. The descendant who found it recognized the repeating pattern from a story his grandmother had told, a tale of how his ancestor had saved an entire village's millet crop by predicting an early flood. He couldn't read Arabic, he never touched a quill, but he knew that the story, woven in thread, had outlived both its speaker and its scribe. Writing, he said, leaves ink. Cloth leaves breath. A loom in the dust. By the 16th century, the Mali Empire began to fragment. The Songhai rose, then fell. Towns were abandoned, others built. Written history began to dominate court records, and oral historians traveled further afield to find patrons. But in quiet courtyards and shady alleyways, the looms clicked on. Cloth carried stories of cattle lost, of sisters reunited, of wells that ran dry, and of babies born beneath baobab trees. They were stories not fit for kings or clerks, but they were no less important. They were stories of remembering who you are, when the world forgets to ask. And so the question lingers. You're standing in a museum now, but your feet are tired in a way that suggests travel, long travel, across deserts, across rivers, across generations. Behind the glass, a narrow strip of indigo cotton, gently faded. It's labeled West African Textile Fragment, circa 15th century. No pattern is described, no translation given. The tag makes no mention of kings, of droughts, of births or markets, or mistakes woven with intention. But if you were from the Niger Bend, if your grandmother had sung certain lullabies, if your uncle still kept a loom beneath his house, you might notice the slanted chevrons near one edge, twinned like the horns of a steer. You might know they refer to a time of hunger ended by an unexpected gift of cattle. You might notice a row of 3 broken zigzags, a funeral perhaps, or a boundary dispute that ended with a shared well. To anyone else, it is a piece of fabric. To you, it's a paragraph. Colonial blindness to threaded memory. By the late 19th century, French and British colonial officials flooded the region. They brought their own tools for memory: census books, school registers, legal archives. And yet, they found entire towns that remembered genealogies back 20 generations without a single sheet of paper. They were skeptical, and so when they entered villages and confiscated artifacts, they often ignored textiles, burning them, trading them, or wrapping rifles in them for the long march home. They took metal, gold, and manuscripts, but they didn't think thread could speak. One colonial official in 1896 wrote in a letter from Bamako, "The cloth is dyed beautifully, though rather repetitive, likely of use only in trade or domestic covering. No writing of note." No writing of note. He didn't realize he was holding a ledger, a protest song, a lineage record, and a harvest calendar. Each row of thread a letter, each color a paragraph. Rediscovering the language of the loom. It wasn't until the 1970s that scholars began to re-examine these traditions seriously. Ethnographers and textile historians returned to towns like Ndomo, Ségou, and Koulikoro. There they met elders who could still read the cloth. One woman interviewed in 1981 identified nearly 40 distinct weaving patterns by name, including Belankete, the footprint that comes back, used to mark the return of someone once thought lost. Jarabafe. From fashion to archive. In modern Mali, Ghana, and Burkina Faso, woven cloth remains central to identity. Kente, Bogolanfini, mudcloth, and strip-woven cotton all trace deep roots to these older traditions of memory. But where once the cloth quietly told stories, today it sometimes shouts. Political figures wear pattern-coded fabrics during speeches. Weddings are organized around specific motifs chosen to reflect the family's shared values. Even designers working in Dakar and Bamako sometimes commission reinterpretations of historic weaves, like the red misaligned protest stripes of the 14th century, recast as fashion-forward statements of heritage. And yet the most enduring pieces are not worn by presidents or sewn by brands. They are folded in chests, kept beneath mattresses, pulled out during naming ceremonies, and each time they are unwrapped, someone explains, "This belonged to my grandmother. It means..." The sentence is always unfinished, because the cloth keeps going, beyond what any speaker can say. The last row. Imagine a weaver, sitting under the sparse shade of a thorn tree, feet on pedals, hands adjusting the shuttle. He is silent, but his mind is full. He has no ink, He does not speak Arabic. He has never seen a printing press, but he remembers. He remembers the day the rains came late. He remembers the way his uncle used to laugh. He remembers the elder who settled a land dispute by trading a goat for 2 lengths of dyed cotton and a chicken. He remembers it all, and so he begins to weave. Not for beauty, not for money, not for kings. He weaves because someone has to remember. He weaves because someday someone might need to know. And as you drift further into sleep tonight, consider this. Is it possible that memory, the kind that matters most, has always been softer than paper and stronger than words? Plant the gnomon in the ground, measure its shadow at noon, repeat at different times of year. Use trigonometry to calculate the curvature of the earth. Yes, trigonometry. This was his idea of fun. While other men of the court were hunting, Al-Biruni was sketching right-angled triangles in the dirt. And he wasn't content to just do it once. He measured angles from mountaintops. He took readings at different elevations. He even calculated the radius of the earth using the height of a hill and the dip of the horizon. His estimate, roughly 6,339 kilometers. The modern value, 6,371. Not bad for a guy without a calculator. Imagine sitting beside al-Biruni in a candlelit room made of packed mud brick somewhere in the Ghaznavid court. It's quiet, except for the steady scrape of a reed pen against parchment. You watch as he draws a perfect circle, using a compass of his own design, then another inside the first, then one slightly tilted, cutting the others. Not decoration. These are spheres, celestial, terrestrial, and hypothetical. He's not making art. He's describing the entire known universe in circles, reinventing geography from the ground up. By the time al-Biruni was in his late 40s, he had already conducted hundreds of local measurements, interviews, and star observations. What he needed now was synthesis. Earlier geographers like Ptolemy had offered a grid-based worldview, dividing the Earth into coordinates, longitudes, and latitudes. It was tidy, but deeply flawed. Distances between cities were often exaggerated or inaccurate. Al-Biruni, ever the pedant in the best sense, wanted precision. He began creating a revised global map using empirical data, long before that term even existed. His method? Meticulous triangulation. From carefully measured shadows, horizon dips, and known distances between certain cities, he built a framework of the known world. He corrected long-standing errors in the placement of cities like Merv, Multan, and Bukhara. And unlike Ptolemy, who treated Africa and Asia as practically fused, al-Biruni left deliberate gaps where information was unclear, an early embrace of intellectual humility. He even noted how the oceans likely connected below Africa, challenging the view that the Indian Ocean was an enclosed body. It was a map full of corrections and also silences. When he didn't know something, he said so. A global mind before global travel. One of al-Biruni's strangest habits to his contemporaries was this. He wrote about places he had never visited, as if he had walked their streets. This wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. By collecting enough readings from other scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim, he used cross-referencing, time differentials, and star data to approximate distances and directions. This made him an early proponent of what we'd now call remote data gathering. He even proposed a method for determining the Earth's circumference using just two observers, stationed hundreds of kilometers apart, who timed the rising of a star to compare their longitude. This required synchronized clocks, which he acknowledged didn't yet exist, but the idea itself was centuries ahead of its time. For al-Biruni, the map wasn't just an image, it was a puzzle. Each missing piece was a question, each misaligned city was a mathematical challenge. And unlike many mapmakers of his age, he didn't rely on hearsay from merchants or conquest logs. He wanted angle. It's the year 1017 CE, and you're riding across a dusty road with the scholar Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. The air smells of dry sagebrush, and your horse, well, it isn't really your horse, but you've been assigned to ride it anyway, is growing tired. You're part of a caravan trailing east, following the mathematician, astronomer, and geographer on his curious journey from the Ghaznavid court toward the edge of the gas-known world. He isn't going to plunder or conquer or even to trade. Al-Biruni is going to look at the stars and possibly ask some local monks about longitude. You're not sure why, but he seems very sure. A life better suited to shadow than to sword. Al-Biruni was born in 973 CE in a region known as Khwarezm, part of today's Uzbekistan. If you picture a young boy crouched in the dust with a stick, drawing circles to track the shadow of a sundial, you wouldn't be far off. Unlike many men of his time who made their mark through conquest or sermon, al-Biruni preferred angles, while others were debating metaphysics or dynastic succession. He was asking quieter questions. How high is the sun? Can you measure the earth without sailing it? Could time be standardized using the movement of stars? He learned Greek, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and Syriac. He read the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Aryabhata, and even Galen, though he was known to mutter disapprovingly when Galen got his facts wrong. Al-Biruni's thirst for knowledge was insatiable, but also meticulous. He wasn't content with simply reading what others wrote. He wanted to check their math. And for that, he needed better measurements. It may seem odd, but one of the things that most frustrated al-Biruni was that none of the Greek, Persian, or Arab geographers could agree where India was. Not generally, people knew where to find it, but mathematically, where was India on a sphere? What was its latitude and longitude? Why didn't the stars match up between cities listed on the same latitude in two different sources? And how, he wondered, could one resolve conflicting worldviews if no one had agreed where anything actually was? He was fascinated by Indian astronomy and its concepts of planetary motion. Some of the ideas matched ancient Greek theories, others did not. And while he disagreed with the Indian idea of an immobile Earth, he never dismissed it rudely. Instead, he wanted to understand why the system worked for those who believed in it. So when Mahmud of Ghazni conquered parts of the Indian subcontinent and took al-Biruni with him, the scholar didn't go kicking and screaming. You're older now, sitting once more in al-Biruni's small study in Ghazni. The room is quieter than it used to be. The lamp sputters occasionally in the early evening light, its flame flickering against the ink-stained pages that surround him. On one wall hangs a wooden quadrant, on another a map not colorful or decorative, but dense with annotations, tiny triangles, and soft ink blots. Al-Biruni, in his 70s now, scratches a correction onto a margin, not because anyone will see it, not because it changes the world, but because it's slightly more accurate than what he wrote last year. Final years a life of margin notes. By the time most men of his era had long since retired or been silenced by politics, al-Biruni was still working, not for fame, nor for a sultan's favor, just because he hadn't finished yet. He composed dozens of treatises, many of which circulated widely across the Islamic world, and some of which would survive into the Renaissance. One of his last great works was the Masudi Canon, a massive compendium of astronomy, mathematics, geography, and even mineralogy. It's easy to imagine a younger scholar flipping through it with bleary eyes decades later, wondering how one man managed to write so much and care so deeply about slope angles and eclipse cycles. But to al-Biruni, the work wasn't tedious. It was clarity. He believed the universe was made of patterns, and that with enough care and shadow measurements, you could begin to see those patterns. The world wasn't random. It was knowable. Maybe not entirely, but enough to try. The map no one quite noticed. It's tempting to imagine that al-Biruni's map changed the world, that it was carried west, translated into Latin, and laid the foundation for modern cartography. But it didn't quite happen like that. Though some of his works reached Andalusia and Byzantium, much of what he created was too technical, too detailed, or too far ahead of its time to be widely understood. European mapmakers, centuries later, would still copy Ptolemy rather than update his mistakes. It wasn't until the 20th century that scholars realized just how close al-Biruni had come to defining concepts like gravitational attraction, geodesy, and even heliocentrism. But he didn't seem to mind. He often wrote that truth wasn't dependent on attention. To strive for understanding, he wrote, is noble even if one is misunderstood. Legacy in footnotes. Though his maps faded from charts and his star tables were overtaken by newer instruments, al-Biruni left a quiet legacy. His idea that measurement must be empirical helped influence Islamic science for generations. His comparative approach to culture laid groundwork for early anthropology. His respect for alternate cosmologies, paired with rigorous critique, offered a model of cross-cultural studies still cited today. In an age of conquest and certainty, he drew circles, measured shadows, wrote equations in the margins of manuscripts no one had asked him to produce. The final question: as the candle burns low, and the stars, those same stars he spent his life measuring, twinkle in the distance, Al-Biruni leans back, almost satisfied. His map of the world is not perfect. It never was. But perhaps, he wonders, the true purpose of a map is not to fix the world in ink, but to show where questions remain. After all, every unmeasured mountain or misunderstood people is just an invitation to learn a little more. And so he asks, quietly, as he places his compass back on the shelf, if the world is round and knowledge always expanding, is any map ever really finished? You find yourself standing on the edge of the Sahara, sometime around the 13th century. The air is dry, not just arid, but desiccating. Everything around you is the color of dust, the sky, the sand, the wind-blown cloaks of Tuareg traders, even the buildings. At first you think the heat is playing tricks on your eyes. The walls of the buildings glitter faintly in the sun, not like gold, like salt. That's because they are. You are in Tagaza, the medieval town built almost entirely from blocks of salt. There are no trees here, no markets, no fresh water, and yet this place was once one of the most important stops on the trans-Saharan trade route, a town where nothing could grow, but everything passed through. The village that wasn't supposed to exist. Tagaza is often described in early Arabic sources not as a city or even a village, but as a work site, permanent and important, yet barely alive. The settlement existed solely because of the salt mines. The miners, mostly enslaved laborers from West Africa, dug deep into the earth using basic tools to extract slabs of salt from underground seams. These slabs were called azalai, and they were not just a commodity. In many parts of West Africa, they were currency. The salt wasn't sprinkled delicately onto food, it preserved meat, cured skins, and most importantly, preserved lives. In the humid savannas to the south, salt was as precious as gold. Some records suggest it was even traded weight for weight with it. Tagaza's only job was to mine it, and to survive. Architecture of desperation. The town had no local building materials, no wood, no clay, no palm fronds. So the miners built with what they had: salt. Salt blocks were cut like stone, stacked into crude rectangles, and covered with camel dung to stop the wind from licking them away. Rain was rare, but when it came, the town melted. It had to be rebuilt constantly. The walls were thick, mostly to resist collapse, but also to keep out the choking winds. Inside, the air was stifling, with the acrid sting of salt in your nose and throat. Water, brought from distant oases, had to be rationed. Everything, food, shelter, rest, was temporary. But the salt? That was eternal, or at least profitable. Camel caravans, stretching hundreds of animals long, arrived to carry the azalai north to Morocco or south to Timbuktu. Each block could weigh 30 kilograms or more, stacked precariously on swaying animals as they crossed thousands of kilometers of sand. Many didn't make it, but enough did to keep Tagaza alive. A life measured in grains. Imagine waking up in Tagaza. There are no birds, no trees, no dew, just the endless crunch of salt beneath your sandals. Meals are simple: dried dates, perhaps a strip of sun-cured meat, and a few sips of water, if you're lucky. The work begins early to avoid the worst heat, but there's no real escape. Deep pits in the salt flats mark the mines, some 10 or 20 meters down, where men chip and hack away with metal tools brought in by traders. The salt is hauled up by hand or using crude pulleys. Every grain stings your skin. Small cuts don't heal here. They become pale pink scars or never stop itching. Wind-blown grit gets into your teeth, your nose, your lungs. Still, the laborers sing as they work. Their voices are low, rhythmic, rising with the swing of pickaxes. Not songs of joy, but songs of memory. Songs from places far greener than here. The overseers, often appointed by the Sultan of Mali, keep tally of the output. Each caravan must be carefully packed, each slab marked with a seal. Nothing is wasted, not even breath. A place without children. One of the oddest things about Tahaza is what's missing: families. There were no women recorded as living in the town during its peak, no children, no old men. It wasn't a community, it was a station, a place men came to work and leave or die. Some returned year after year, others stayed for months or seasons. Tahaza was not a town built to last. It was a skeleton town, a necessary blip on a long and dangerous trade artery. And yet, empires depended on it. The Mali Empire, and later the Songhai Empire, taxed salt from Tahaza heavily. Caravans had to pass through checkpoints, merchants paid duties, and the salt funded palaces, schools, mosques. The great cities of West Africa were built, in part, on the backs of these crumbling salt walls. But as you sit here, watching the sun climb higher and higher in the shimmering sky, you might begin to wonder, what happens to a place that everyone needs, but no one wants to live in? You awaken again to that pale gleam on the horizon, the shimmer of 100 camel loads, approaching with the slow rhythm of a sunburnt tide. The camel bells jingle faintly, distant but steady. From the distance, the caravan looks like a mirage. But it is real, and with it comes one of the few breaks in the monotony of Tagaza's salted silence. Trade. The caravan isn't just carrying goods, it carries word of empires, whispers of uprisings, the price of gold in Timbuktu, and maybe, if you're lucky, a handful of dried figs from Morocco. The long salt road. The traders who arrive in Tagaza have crossed hundreds of miles of desert, some from the north, often Berber or Arab merchants from Morocco, others from the south, Mande or Soninke traders bringing kola nuts, cloth, ivory, and slaves. These trans-Saharan trade routes, often called the salt roads, were ancient even in al-Bakri's time. Generations of camels had worn narrow grooves in the sand, invisible to outsiders but known intimately by the desert traders. Each caravan required intense planning. Water caches buried beneath dunes, hidden oases, guides who knew the sandstorms by taste. Camels were chosen carefully, strong ones, able to endure weeks with minimal water, their padded feet adapted to the shifting ground. Each carried 2 or 3 salt slabs lashed to either side. 1,000 camels meant 2 or 3,000 slabs of salt. That was wealth on legs. The politics of a salt slab. Salt wasn't just valuable because people needed it. It was valuable because kings said so. The rulers of Mali and later Songhai understood the delicate balance of salt supply and demand. They imposed heavy taxes on both the salt's export and its mining. Tagaza itself was never truly independent. It was administered by officials sent from the royal court, often unpopular, always well-fed. These officials didn't mine, of course. Their job was to count. Every slab of salt had to be registered. Caravans required official documentation. Taxes were paid in kind, salt slabs given to the crown before anyone else received their share. There were also bribes. If your caravan wanted to move faster, you might offer a little extra, a slab here, a coin there. The salt that built kings' treasuries also greased the gears of desert politics. In this way, Tagaza became salt money and human cost. In medieval Ghana and Mali, salt could literally be used as money. 1 slab might buy a sheep, 2 could buy a goat and some millet. In some towns, merchants carried salt pebbles in their pouches the way others carried silver coins. Yet here in Tagaza, where it all came from, no one got rich. The miners were often enslaved men, captured in raids or sold from distant regions. Others were prisoners of war. A few were freemen, perhaps working off a debt or sent here by clan obligation. But once inside the mines, distinctions blurred. Salt burned the skin, it dried the lips, it inflamed the lungs, it made you thirsty in a way that water couldn't fix. Yet every morning the miners returned to their pits, not because they had a choice, but because their lives, like the desert itself, had been carved into shape long ago. When the caravans rest. On the rare days when the caravan stayed more than a few hours, Tagaza came briefly to life. Cook fires appeared, camels grunted and settled onto their knees. Traders spread out blankets displaying trinkets, cloth, spices. Stories were exchanged. Gossip flowed more easily than water. Some men played music, drums, flutes, lutes, fashioned from gourd and hide. For a moment, Tagaza was more than salt, but the rest was fleeting. No caravan lingered long. The longer you stayed in Tagaza, the more likely your goods would melt, your camels would founder, and your skin would begin to crack. And so, after food was shared and loads were redistributed, the traders moved on, north to Sijil Masa, south to Walata or Timbuktu. Tagaza was left behind, as it always was, hollow and gleaming in the sun. Still, the caravans keep coming, still, the salt keeps flowing, and as the official scribes tally up another shipment, you may wonder, how long can a town survive when its wealth is carved from its own body?
You open your eyes again in Tagaza, but something is different. There are fewer sounds now. No camel bells, no singing. The wind hums through crumbling salt walls, and the air tastes older somehow. The sun still burns, but nothing glitters. There is only silence. Tagaza has begun to die. The ghost town of gold's shadow. By the 16th century, Tagaza's place in the salt trade had begun to fade. Not because the mines were empty, far from it. The desert still held veins of salt waiting like buried bones, but the world around it was shifting. The Songhai Empire was rising, challenging Mali's control of trade. New caravan routes emerged, and Tagaza, isolated and vulnerable, sat squarely in the crosshairs of rival powers. Then came the raids. In 1591, Moroccan troops under Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur invaded the Songhai Empire, armed with gunpowder and ambition. Though the invasion targeted the cities of Gao, Timbuktu, and Jen, it disrupted the fragile supply lines that kept desert outposts alive. Without protection from an empire, Tagaza was no longer a strategic asset. It was just a pile of salt, waiting to be plundered. Nomadic raiders attacked the settlement. The miners, mostly enslaved and unarmed, fled or were taken. The remaining traders, officials, and guards retreated north or vanished into the desert. There was no battle, no dramatic fall. Tagaza simply stopped. In the records, a whisper. We know about Tagaza's end not from epic chronicles or dramatic letters, but from the absence of detail. Later accounts mention a new salt center, Taudani, located farther west, deeper into the desert. By the 17th century, Tagaza had vanished from most maps. Where once it had been a necessary evil, it had become obsolete.
Ibn Battuta, who visited Tagaza in the 14th century, had called it a village with no comforts. He noted how even the water had to be brought from 3 days away, and how the stench from camel dung used to patch the walls made life miserable. Few mourned its disappearance. It left behind no ruins, really. Salt melts. Wind wears it down. Unlike the stone ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the temples of Angkor, Tagaza built no monuments. It wasn't supposed to last. Even the graves have dissolved. Salt as memory. And yet, Tagaza lives on, strangely, in the language of trade, in the wealth it once generated, in the songs of the Tuareg caravaneers who still speak of the ancient salt route. Its legacy is not architectural but economic. The wealth of medieval Mali, the splendor that allowed Mansa Musa to scatter gold through Cairo, was made possible in part by salt carved from the ground here. Salt shaped diplomacy. It formed the foundation of Saharan commerce. It preserved food, defined wages, and built cities far from the desert. But the place it came from, the dry, shining grave of Tagaza, was never meant to be a city. It was meant to be used, and so it was. Final reflections. If you stood in the Sahara today where Tagaza once sat, you'd find only faint scars in the dust. A few salt pits still glimmer beneath the surface, but nothing is left of the old walls, or the dung-plastered roofs, or the careful records once kept by imperial scribes. Time has returned it to what it was before, a silence too vast to measure. And perhaps that is the oddest truth of all, that the town that built empires was never really a town, and the people who sustained it have no monuments but memory. So the next time you sprinkle salt on a meal, consider this. What forgotten hands once carved it from a place where nothing could grow and no one was meant to stay? Picture yourself walking barefoot through the high plateau of southeastern Africa, somewhere near modern-day Zimbabwe. The air is dry, fragrant with dust and wild thyme, and the wind whispers through tall grass like a forgotten language. In the distance, you see something unexpected. Vast, looping stone walls rising from the earth like the ribs of a buried giant. There are no gates, no mortar, no name carved into the stone, just gray granite walls, curving, silent, and patient. This is Great Zimbabwe, and for centuries it has puzzled nearly everyone who saw it. Granite by the ton, set without cement. The stone structures of Great Zimbabwe were built between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. Their creators, ancestors of the Shona people, stacked more than 900,000 granite blocks to form walls over 30 feet tall and 15 feet thick without using a drop of mortar. The labor, done by hand. The tools, likely nothing more than chisels, wedges, and an unfathomable amount of time. Granite doesn't give up easily. To work with it, builders waited for cold nights to crack the rock naturally, or used controlled fires to make the stone split. The resulting blocks were then carried, often up slopes, and fitted together with startling precision. There was no rush. A wall could take decades. And in Great Zimbabwe, patience was architecture. Even the layout of the city speaks of thoughtful restraint. Instead of right angles or neat squares, the structures curve with the contours of the land, snaking through hills, folding into valleys, hiding and revealing themselves with every step. It feels designed to be remembered, but not explained. Who lived here, and why? At its peak, Great Zimbabwe may have housed 10 to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest pre-colonial cities in sub-Saharan Africa. But they didn't all live inside the stone enclosures. The elite, royalty, advisors, and spiritual leaders occupied the stone structures. The rest lived in more humble dwellings of clay and thatch beyond the city walls. The largest enclosure, often called the Great Enclosure, might have been used for rituals, or as a royal residence, or as a symbolic expression of power. No one can quite agree. There are narrow passageways, blind alleys, and strange architectural flourishes that don't seem practical, like a giant conical tower with no door or stairwell, just rising in the center like a monument to stubborn mystery. And that's part of the charm. Great Zimbabwe was not trying to be convenient. For all its grandeur, Great Zimbabwe was never exactly bustling. There were no paved streets, no massive armies, no imperial decrees etched in stone. It thrived because it was connected through trade routes that spanned the Indian Ocean, linking this inland city to ports like Kilwa, Sofala, and beyond to Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and Arab coins here. Relics of a global trade network with Great Zimbabwe as a quiet inland hub. What did it offer in return? Mostly gold and ivory. The surrounding land was rich in mineral resources, and the elite controlled the labor that extracted them. Traders didn't come for sightseeing. They came to negotiate, to offload goods, to carry news. And yet, this wasn't a rough marketplace filled with haggling and shouting. Great Zimbabwe feels different. Even now, centuries later, its atmosphere remains somehow reserved, as if the city itself preferred to whisper rather than boast. As you stand at the top of the hill complex, looking down at the broken grandeur below, you might wonder, why would a culture pour so much effort into a city without writing its name in stone?
There's something particularly bittersweet about a place like Great Zimbabwe. It rose from stone and soil without fanfare, dominated the region in silence, and then, like a whisper finally carried off by the wind, declined so completely that even its name was forgotten. Now, centuries later, we wander its ruins trying to decode the language of its walls. Not a lost language exactly, but a never-written one. So what happened to the great city that chose not to boast? When greatness meets overgrazing. The downfall of Great Zimbabwe wasn't the result of war or invasion. There's no record of flaming siege towers or desperate last stands. Instead, the evidence points to something far more mundane and oddly soothing in its inevitability: ecological exhaustion. By the 15th century, the city had simply outgrown its landscape. With tens of thousands of people, large herds of cattle, and constant demands on the land for food, firewood, and building materials, the local environment began to suffer. Deforestation increased. Soil eroded. Pastures turned to dust. The granite stone once pulled from the nearby hills to build those mighty enclosures offered no help with farming or firewood. People had to travel farther and farther to gather fuel and graze animals. And over time, the effort exceeded the reward. Eventually, the city's leaders began to move, first seasonally, then permanently, establishing new centers of power elsewhere. Great Zimbabwe was not abandoned in a dramatic exodus, but rather quietly, gradually, as if even its decline preferred not to be noticed. By the early 16th century, the city was nearly empty. The stone walls remained, of course, they always would. But the people were gone, leaving no written farewells. Rediscovered, misunderstood, and appropriated. When European explorers arrived in southern Africa centuries later and stumbled upon the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, they were perplexed, and then, unfortunately, dismissive. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many colonial officials refused to believe that an indigenous African civilization could have created such impressive architecture. Theories sprang up suggesting that the site had been built by Phoenicians, Arabs, or even wandering Israelites. Anything, it seemed, but local African people. Some of this skepticism was political, part of a broader colonial narrative that sought to paint African societies as inherently primitive. Legacy in silence and the naming of a nation. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands not just as a ruin, but as a symbol. When Zimbabwe gained independence from Britain in 1980, it chose to name itself after this ancient city, a quiet reclamation of heritage and pride. The stone birds of Great Zimbabwe appear on the nation's flag, currency, and public buildings, finally acknowledged as part of a long and rich African history. But still, the site retains its mystery. No one knows exactly what the conical tower meant. No one has found a tomb of a king. No one has uncovered a royal proclamation or a diary carved into stone. What we have is stone itself, a language of arrangement, space, and curve.
walls that tell us nothing explicitly but suggest everything with their presence. So now, as you leave the hill complex behind, perhaps for the last time, you might notice how quiet the place still feels. Not abandoned exactly, but at peace with its own forgottenness. And as you trace one final curve of granite with your hand, maybe you'll ask, is it possible that the most powerful cities are the ones that don't need to explain themselves at all? You awaken on a cool morning, somewhere along the Yellow River, around 100 BCE. A rooster crows. The air smells faintly of millet porridge and wet reeds. In the corner of your family's modest courtyard, tied up neatly with hemp string, is a stack of bamboo slips. These are poems. They're tax records, because you live under the Han Dynasty now, a sprawling imperial system built not just on soldiers and silk, but on very neat handwriting and the remarkable idea that everyone in China should pay a bit of grain to a ledger, regardless of whether they've ever seen the capital. The empire that loved ledgers. The Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, was one of the longest and most influential in Chinese history. It gave China its name, Hanren meaning Han people. It oversaw the expansion of the Silk Road. It made Confucianism the state ideology. But it also did something quietly astonishing. It managed to count almost everybody. At the heart of this empire was bureaucracy, an army of scribes, clerks, tax collectors, inspectors, and regional officials whose job was not to fight, but to know. To know how much land you owned, how many sons you had, how many oxen, whether or not your granary was full, and if it wasn't, whether you might be hiding grain in your attic. And if you were, well, they had a form for that, filing your civic soul in triplicate taxes. Under the Han, weren't paid in coins, though they existed, but in kind, mostly grain, textiles, and labor. If you were a commoner farmer, your obligations were laid out quite clearly. A fixed portion of your annual harvest went to the state granary. You, or a male from your household, had to perform 1 month of labor each year, repairing roads, building canals, or serving as a soldier. You were also expected to contribute cloth, firewood, salt, or other local products, depending on your region. All of this was recorded meticulously. Each household had a registry, kept on bamboo strips or silk, listing who lived there, how old they were, what property they held, and how much tax they owed. These records were copied in triplicate, one for the local magistrate, one for the regional office, and one sent, carefully wrapped and boxed, to the imperial archives near the capital of Chang'an. You may never leave your village, but your name, age, and oat yield might be sitting on a desk hundreds of miles away. Inspectors with brushes, not swords. Han officials weren't feared for their armor, they were feared for their patience. An inspector might arrive in your village once a year, brush tucked neatly into his sash, scroll case slung over one shoulder. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't threaten. He would simply ask to see your records. If your barn looked suspiciously full but your slip said modest yield due to drought, he might make a small note. If your neighbor claimed to have 3 sons but you'd seen 5 boys running around, he might knock on their door next. This wasn't surveillance in the modern sense. It was bureaucratic osmosis, data collected slowly, quietly, over generations. And it worked. At its height, the Han tax system supported over 60 million people, paid for a professional army, built vast public works, and maintained roads stretching thousands of miles across East Asia. All because somewhere, A scribe knew how many sheaves of wheat you harvested in early autumn. So as you sit down with your porridge, brush in hand, preparing to write this year's family record, you might pause to consider what kind of empire survives, not by conquering land, but by counting it. You sit at the edge of the threshing floor, brushing chaff from your sleeves. Around you, the village has entered its post-harvest lull. Chickens peck near the granary gates. The elders sit quietly in the shade, debating whether the inspector this year will notice that one of the listed sons on the family form is actually the cousin's boy from next door. This isn't fraud exactly. It's more like a cultural hobby, tweaking the record ever so slightly, always with plausible deniability. But rest assured, the hand bureaucracy already knows, or if it doesn't now, it soon will. The state granary, where grain becomes civilization. In Han China, granaries were not just buildings, they were institutions. Each district was expected to maintain a network of them, stocked with grain collected through taxes. These grain stores had multiple roles: stabilizing prices. If there was a bumper crop, the state might buy excess grain to prevent a market crash. If there was a drought, it released grain to prevent famine. Feeding armies. Granaries sustained the imperial troops, especially on the long western campaigns that opened the Silk Road. Backstopping disaster. A good local administrator was judged not just by how much tax he collected, but how well he prepared for lean years. But managing this system required information, reams of it. Clerks tracked how much grain each family contributed, which households needed relief, what went into storage, and when it went bad. Yes, there were even inspectors for mold. This may not sound thrilling, but to the Han, it was practically a sacred duty. A full granary was a moral good, an empty one, a political failure. The curious case of the floating dead. One of the strangest artifacts of Han bureaucracy is how thoroughly it recorded people. So thoroughly, in fact, that sometimes the dead kept paying taxes. Records weren't always updated promptly. A person who died in spring might still be listed in autumn. In some cases, families found it more convenient to keep the deceased alive on paper, especially if that person had been counted toward the household's labor quota or tax threshold. These so-called ghost names could linger in village records for years. Inspectors occasionally uncovered them, usually after noticing inconsistencies like a centenarian still listed as fit for military duty, but most were allowed to drift silently through the system, a kind of posthumous participation in the civic order. In Han China, death didn't always mean retirement from paperwork. The nobility of ink. Let's take a moment to appreciate the humble tools behind this system. It was an art, slow, careful, and deliberate. A single tax document might take hours. The layout mattered. Characters had to be neat, legible, and consistent. A sloppy brush stroke could misreport someone's land holdings, or worse, misassign their labor duties to a neighbor who would not be amused. Over time, clerks developed elegant shorthand systems and filing methods. Record-keeping schools emerged. Positions in local offices became prestigious, even hereditary. In a society shaped by Confucian ideals of order and hierarchy, the scribe was a quiet hero. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but essential. The empire of size Imagine the rhythm of a day in one of these dusty magistrate offices, brushes scratching on silk, slips rustling in bundles, a clerk sighing over an illogical grain report from a village where the birth rate has somehow tripled overnight. Outside farmers bring bundles of millet wrapped in reed mats, waiting to have their yields weighed and logged. Children peer into the open doors, watching the robed officials with awe and not a little boredom. This wasn't an empire of emperors. It was an empire of mid-level managers, of men who cared deeply about decimal grain weights and whose handwriting could mean the difference between tax forgiveness and conscription. And it worked, perhaps because it was so mundane. There was nothing to rebel against exactly, only forms to fill out. So, as you pack your household's records into a reed basket for the messenger to carry off to the regional office, you may find yourself asking, did the strength of the Han lie not in its army, but in its ability to notice you, even when you didn't want to be noticed?
It's late afternoon in a Roman military outpost somewhere near the Rhine frontier. You've just marched 17 miles with a pilum on your back, your legs are sore, and there's grit in your teeth. But before you eat, before you sleep, before you so much as loosen your belt, you have one more duty: your laundry. Because even the might of Rome, its legions, its roads, its empire-spanning glory, ran on clean tunics. And those tunics? They were washed in fermented human urine. The empire that smelled a bit odd. To modern minds, Rome is all columns and conquests, but beneath that polished marble was a surprisingly practical, often pungent, set of routines. And central to daily Roman life, whether you were a senator or a centurion, was clothing maintenance. Roman soldiers were issued simple tunics made of wool, warm in winter, breathable in summer, and terribly absorbent when trudging through the mud. After days on the march, the result was predictable: crusty, sweat-soaked, and unfit even for battle. Enter the fullones, Rome's professional launderers. These weren't just back-alley soap scrubbers. The fullonica, laundry shop, was a regulated, respected part of Roman urban life. Launderers paid taxes. They used specialized vats, brushes, and chemical processes. And their most important ingredient? Urine. Yes, it was collected. Publicly, urine was prized in Roman cleaning, because it contains ammonia, a natural cleaning agent that breaks down dirt and grease. In the absence of soap, which was rare and expensive, a mixture of urine and water, sometimes combined with wood ash, made an effective detergent. But where did they get it? From public fulonicae une, urine jars placed strategically around cities and garrisons. Citizens were encouraged and sometimes required to contribute. A good Roman public toilet wasn't just a convenience, it was a laundry supply depot. The contents were collected daily, fermented for stronger ammonia, and then used to soak soldiers' tunics in great stone vats. Launderers would stomp the garments by foot, rhythmically pressing out grime, sweat, and battlefield debris. If you're imagining a grape-stomping festival, lower your expectations by about 10 degrees and increase the smell by 100.
Laundry as a military protocol. Clean clothing wasn't just for show, it was strategy. Roman officers believed that morale, discipline, and hygiene were connected. A dirty soldier was seen as sloppy. A clean tunic, properly belted, was a mark of order. Regular inspections included not just weapon condition, but appearance. Soldiers were expected to keep their sandals repaired and tied, polish armor fittings, and yes, present tunics that were reasonably clean and odor-free by Roman standards. Laundry rotations were built into camp life. After a march or a battle, you might take your tunic to a local fuller, or if none were available, handle it yourself in a ditch or a stream, using ash
and whatever vinegar you could scrounge from the rations. In larger fortresses, civilian fulons operated under contract with the army, laundering not only soldier tunics but cloaks, bandages, and even leather harnesses. A good laundryman might earn a soldier's lifelong gratitude and occasional complaints about over-bleaching. So as you hang your slightly sour-smelling tunic on a line between two olive trees, watching the steam rise off your sandals, you may pause to wonder, what kind of empire fights wars and wins them on the strength of well-washed wool?
It's late afternoon in a Roman military outpost somewhere near the Rhine frontier. You've just marched 17 miles with a pilum on your back, your legs are sore and there's grit in your teeth. But before you eat, before you sleep, before you so much as loosen your belt, you have one more duty: your laundry. Because even the might of Rome, its legions, its roads, its empire-spanning glory, ran on clean tunics. And those tunics, they were washed in fermented human urine. The empire that smelled a bit odd. To modern minds, Rome is all columns and conquests, but beneath that polished marble was a surprisingly practical, often pungent set of routines, and central to daily Roman life, whether you were a senator or a centurion, was clothing maintenance. Roman soldiers were issued simple tunics made of wool, warm in winter, breathable in summer, and terribly absorbent when trudging through the mud. After days on the march, the result was predictable: crusty, sweat-soaked, and unfit even for battle. Enter the fulons, Rome's professional launderers. These weren't just back-alley soap scrubbers. The fulonica laundry shop was a regulated, respected part of Roman urban life. Launderers paid taxes, they used specialized vats, brushes, and chemical processes, and their most important ingredient, urine. Yes, it was collected. Publicly, urine was prized in Roman cleaning because it contains ammonia, a natural cleaning agent that breaks down dirt and grease. In the absence of soap, which was rare and expensive, a mixture of urine and water, sometimes combined with wood ash, made an effective detergent. But where did they get it? From public fulonicae urinae, urine jars placed strategically around cities and garrisons. Citizens were encouraged and sometimes required to contribute. A good Roman public toilet wasn't just a convenience, it was a laundry supply depot. The contents were collected daily, fermented for stronger ammonia, and then used to soak soldiers' tunics in great stone vats. Launderers would stomp the garments by foot, rhythmically pressing out grime, sweat, and battlefield debris. If you're imagining a grape-stomping festival, lower your expectations by about 10 degrees and increase the smell by 100. Laundry as a military protocol. Clean clothing wasn't just for show, it was strategy. Roman officers believed that morale, discipline, and hygiene were connected. A dirty soldier was seen as sloppy. A clean tunic, properly belted, was a mark of order. Regular inspections included not just weapon condition but appearance. Soldiers were expected to keep their sandals repaired and tied, polish armor fittings, and yes, laundry rotations were built into camp life. After a march or a battle, you might take your tunic to a local fuller, or if none were available, handle it yourself in a ditch or a stream, using ash and whatever vinegar you could scrounge from the rations. In larger fortresses, civilian fulons operated under contract with the army, laundering not only soldier tunics but cloaks, bandages, and even leather harnesses. A good laundryman might earn a soldier's lifelong gratitude and occasional complaints about over-bleaching. So, as you hang your slightly sour-smelling tunic on a line between two olive trees, watching the steam rise off your sandals, you may pause to wonder.
The season has changed again. The millet has been threshed, your second cousin has just been assigned to dig irrigation ditches 2 counties over. A new magistrate has arrived, young and determined, still smoothing his robes too often and pretending not to notice that the previous tax collector misplaced last spring's census. But the bamboo slips remain, tied with string, written in neat brushstrokes, wrapped in reed, delivered on muleback across mountains, rivers, and years. This is what holds the Han dynasty together. Not force, not fear, but form. The bureaucratic immortality of the Han. The Han bureaucracy didn't end when a tax collector died, or when a village vanished. The system had its own kind of memory, a slow, redundant, self-replicating logic that kept ticking long after any one person stopped writing. It's one of the reasons the dynasty lasted over 4 centuries, with a short interruption in the middle. Where other empires relied on dynastic charisma or divine kingship, the Han cultivated habits. Grain would be planted, cloth would be woven, births would be tallied, slips would be copied and bundled and sent along to a clerk in Chang'an, who would sigh, make tea, and copy them again. This wasn't efficiency in the modern sense, but it was resilience. Every change, new tax policies, grain quotas, corvée exemptions, was documented, archived, and reviewed. Future scribes might unroll a 50-year-old bamboo slip, nod thoughtfully, and write a small comment in the margin before binding it again. Han governance was a living library. When records were more trusted than memories. In a society shaped by Confucian ideals of duty and structure, record-keeping wasn't a mere clerical task. It was moral. To misrecord someone's tax yield wasn't just a mistake. It was a disruption in the natural order. Thus, bureaucrats trained not just in writing, but in virtue. They were expected to be fair, calm, impartial. In theory, a perfect clerk had no enemies, no favorites, and a deep emotional attachment to correct punctuation. Villagers sometimes found this frustrating. "I gave that millet," you might say, gesturing to the field where it had once been. "But it's not listed on your slip," the clerk would reply gently, eyes flicking downward. And that was that. The gentle collapse of a very organized system. By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Han bureaucracy began to fray, not because it failed, but because it became too much. Too many forms, too many exemptions, too many local elites finding ways to shield their land from taxes while shifting burdens onto the poor. When the dynasty finally fell in 220 CE, it wasn't because the forms stopped, but because the people carrying them no longer agreed on who they worked for. Even then, the legacy endured. Later dynasties, like the Tang and Song, would resurrect and refine the Han system, adapting it with new technologies, paper, printing, and eventually imperial exams. But the idea remained the same, that a great empire could live through ink. A paper trail across time. Today, fragments of Han bamboo slips survive, discovered in desert outposts, tombs, and ruined archives. They include everything from legal cases to salt tax receipts, from school exercises to official grain tallies. One slip simply reads, "One bundle of reeds, certified." Another lists a widow's reduced tax rate due to illness. A third, barely legible, records the repair of a state-owned ox cart in the year 71 CE. They are ordinary, but their very ordinariness is what makes them extraordinary.
While emperors died and battles raged, someone was always copying a receipt, binding it with silk, filing it away, and so as the shadows lengthen and the bamboo rustles in the courtyard breeze, you may find yourself staring at your family's tax record with quiet admiration, not for its eloquence, but for its permanence, and wondering, what if the truest form of immortality is being listed in a system that simply refuses to forget?
The sun dips low over the castrum. Laundry lines sway gently in the wind, cloaks and tunics catching the fading light like battle flags of domesticity. Somewhere near the latrines, a junior officer is arguing that vinegar is not an acceptable substitute for a missed tunic inspection. The laundryman shrugs. It's the end of another long Roman day. And beneath it all, beneath the grinding of sandals, the creak of armor, and the rustle of census scrolls, runs the quiet machinery of washing, rinsing, stretching, drying, and folding. An empire can rise by the sword, but it endures by the stitch. Laundry as moral order. In Roman military culture, cleanliness was not just about hygiene, it was a moral virtue. Cato the Elder once wrote that soldiers should appear with firm sandals, sharp weapons, and an odor neither excessive nor absent. It wasn't about luxury, it was about discipline, attention, and self-respect. Dirty tunics could signal disorder, and disorder signaled weakness, so the army codified laundry. Soldiers received exact cloth rations. Cloak repair was regulated, storage chests in camps had assigned spaces for freshly washed garments, and inspections included textile checks. Launderers became gatekeepers of morale. If you were late to inspection with a rumpled tunic, the fuller might be summoned and asked for a written excuse. Tunics still damp from third rinse due to vinegar over application. They might not carry swords, but laundrymen wielded power all the same. By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman army was overstretched. Garrisons sat too far from supply lines. Trade disruptions and inflation reduced the availability of salt, vinegar, and cloth. And gradually, as local governors took more control over logistics, the humble Phallonica became a casualty of administrative overload. Some garrisons stopped outsourcing laundry entirely. Soldiers were ordered to self-wash garments, often in freezing rivers with ash and grit. The results were mixed. Cloth wore out faster, infections rose, morale declined. A few enterprising launderers hung on, especially in cities, but the heyday of professional legionary laundry was over. What replaced it was improvisation. Patches sewn with boot thread, tunics dried over campfires, grease stains ignored if the soldier could still hold a spear. When Rome fell, the Phallonis faded into obscurity. Many were absorbed into early medieval guilds, dyers, weavers, soap makers, but their records stopped. No one stomped wool in vats of aged urine anymore. Public urinals were no longer considered state infrastructure, and Roman laundry law was replaced with looser, more chaotic customs. Yet their legacy survived in language. In some Romance languages, words for to clean, to bleach, or even to refine trace back to the Latin fulere, a faint echo of the men who once spent their days elbow-deep in sour-smelling tubs, preserving the dignity of an empire through the magic of ammonia. A final inspection. You tighten your belt, straighten your cloak, and stand in the evening line for final inspection. Around you, the legion is quiet, tunics are neat, cloaks are crisp. Somewhere behind you, a laundryman packs up his tools, brushes wrapped, vinegar sealed, tunic tags returned. He won't be remembered in the marble arches or the history scrolls, but for now, every soldier here owes him something. And as you glance down at your freshly whitened garment, perfectly dry and folded to regulation width, you may wonder, in the long twilight of Rome, when banners fell and roads cracked, did the empire truly collapse the day it stopped caring whether its tunics were clean?
It's a blisteringly hot July afternoon in 14th century France. The village baker has stripped to his linen undershirt. Dogs are panting under carts. The fishmonger's stand smells like disappointment. And yet, just outside the manor hall, a silver tray is being carried across a shaded garden. bearing a bowl of chilled cream layered with sugared berries set atop a bed of ice. Yes, ice. In July, without sorcery. This isn't a trick, it's refrigeration, medieval style. Because long before electricity, before ice boxes, even before the word refrigeration itself, people had already figured out how to store winter for summer. At the heart of this miracle is a building that, from the outside, barely looks like anything at all. It's called an ice house, a sunken, domed, earth-covered structure designed to trap winter's breath. These buildings, often found on large estates or near monasteries, were deceptively simple. They worked through insulation, compression, and shade. The process began in winter. When ponds froze, laborers broke the ice into blocks with chisels and sledged them back to the estate. The ice was layered with straw, hay, or even sawdust, materials that slowed melting, and packed tightly into the chamber of the ice house. The building's thick stone or clay walls, usually several feet underground, kept the internal temperature low well into the warmer months. And there, in the belly of the earth, summer snow waited. Naturally, this kind of cold luxury wasn't available to everyone. Ice storage was expensive, requiring labor, land, and patience. In medieval Europe, ice was most commonly used by life storage with lexa displored and the avocations with card for exceptional point. And of Mado lates, likes about them and over in evening presence. Wealthy nobles who enjoyed chilled wine or desserts, religious orders preserving fish, fruits, or medicines, physicians experimenting with cold treatments, bakers and brewers needing temperature control for certain goods, and occasionally kings who just liked to show off. There's record of Louis XIV delighting guests with strawberries served in snow, and medieval Arabic physicians prescribing ice water compresses for feverish patients, cold, refreshing, and oddly modern. In hot climates like Persia and the Mughal Empire, more advanced structures known as yakchuls, literally ice pits, were built combining domes, wind catchers, and evaporative cooling. These allowed not just storage but even production of ice in desert conditions.
Summer cold as social power. The presence of chilled food at a summer feast was more than a culinary flex. It was social theater. Imagine the effect. While peasants drink warm ale and eat sun-dried bread, the Lord's table glitters with sugared pears cooled on a bed of sleet. The noblewoman dabs her cheek with a cloth soaked in icy rose water. The steward mentions, casually, that the ice was cut from a private pond and carried on the backs of 20 men. The message is clear. Even the sun does not disobey this household. And so ice became a symbol not just of wealth, but of command over nature. While others sweated, nobles glided through summer wrapped in cool linens and sipping wine at cellar temperature. So, as you duck into the mossy, domed silence of the estate's ice house, cool air rising from the pit, you may find yourself wondering, in a world without freezers, was the true luxury not gold or silk, but the ability to conjure winter in July?
The air inside the ice house is thick and quiet. The straw rustles faintly beneath your sandals. Somewhere nearby, a damp breeze slips down a stone stairwell, brushing past the sides of the pit like a ghost that's forgotten its errand. And buried at the bottom of all this insulation, beneath a layer of sawdust and hay, lies a season. A frozen January preserved deep into August. It's a marvel of timing, material, and patience, not just a place to store ice, but to slow time itself. And in the age before machines, this was one of humanity's cleverest inventions. How to store ice without a thermometer. Constructing an effective ice house wasn't guesswork. It was careful, generational knowledge passed from steward to steward. These were the guiding principles. Location was everything. Ice houses were placed in shaded areas, often on the north side of a hill or beneath a copse of trees. The farther they could be buried underground, the better. Walls had to breathe, but not too much. Builders used porous materials like brick or clay, combined with thatch and stone. Some even designed interior drainage systems to carry away meltwater, preventing the remaining ice from accelerating its own decline. Straw was the magic ingredient. Straw was light, cheap, and a surprisingly effective insulator. When layered between ice blocks, it created air pockets that slowed heat transfer. It also wicked away moisture. The better the straw, the slower the melt. Ice compression was key. Ice blocks weren't stored loosely. They were tightly packed, sometimes broken and then compacted into solid slabs. Less air meant less melting. More density meant longer preservation. All this, and they never once said thermal inertia. But they knew it. The cold chain, medieval style. Once stored, the ice could then begin its secondary journey, out into the world. The states developed systems to manage their frozen supply. Ice was rationed for different uses: medical, to cool compresses or preserve herbal mixtures; kitchen, for chilling wine, fruits, or creams, not freezing, just cooling; display, to create dramatic tablescapes or centerpieces with snow in summer. Delivery involved insulated chests, lined with straw or cloth, and careful timing. A servant might rise at dawn to retrieve a block from the pit, wrapping it tightly and carrying it uphill just in time for the Lord's breakfast. In larger manors, the steward kept an ice ledger, noting the amount removed and how long it took to melt. Wasted ice was frowned upon. Ice was precious and tracked with all the anxiety of gold. And as for where it came from,
Cold Wars. Icehouse rivalries. In noble circles, it wasn't unheard of for families to boast about their icehouse performance. At a banquet, a guest might casually ask, "Still using last December's ice?" To which the host, if satisfied, might nod, "Indeed, still sweet and firm." Some even held informal ice-offs, challenges to see whose supply would last the longest through the summer. At monasteries, cellarers tracked their melting rates and devised new straw-packing methods, often without telling neighboring abbeys. And on occasion, tragedy struck. A heavy rain might seep into the vault, or a rat might chew a drain plug, or, most dire of all, a steward might fail to pack the blocks tightly enough, letting warm air between the layers. The result? Premature melt. No chilled cherries. No dinner spectacle. And no small shame. But not every icehouse was grand. In colder regions, even modest farms built ice pits, simple holes lined with thatch and covered with wooden lids. These were for preserving meat, milk, or, occasionally, root vegetables. In places like Scandinavia, Tibet, or the high Andes, similar traditions evolved, using natural snowfields, glacier ice, or shaded mountain clefts to store perishables. Across centuries and continents, the idea remained constant: preserve the cold, and you preserve the future. Even if only for a week or two longer. So, as you sip lightly cooled wine on a blazing afternoon,
your back to the sweating stone walls of the ice house, you might quietly marvel. Was this the closest the Middle Ages ever came to time travel, bringing a winter's breath into a summer feast?
The feast is underway. Courtiers laugh too loudly. Children chase each other between tables. Minstrels pluck slow melodies in a shaded corner, and somewhere above the commotion a steward moves carefully with a chilled dessert balanced on a silver tray. Inside the bowl is a glistening concoction, clotted cream folded with rose water, a scattering of pomegranate seeds, and resting beneath it, a bed of shaved ice. In the middle of July. No one at the table asks how it's possible. They only admire the chill against their spoon, the way the condensation beads on the bowl, the faint steam rising in the summer heat. But behind this tiny miracle lies a forgotten infrastructure, a world of snow haulers, straw packers, clay pit diggers, ledger keepers, and the cold, quiet rooms they served, and all of it was about to melt away. A cooling legacy in a warming world. As the centuries turned, so did the climate. The so-called Little Ice Age, roughly 1300–1850 CE, brought colder winters across much of Europe and Asia. On one hand, this helped the ice trade. It meant thicker ice, longer collection seasons, and a greater abundance of natural supply. But on the other hand, the socio-economic tides were shifting. With the decline of feudal estates and the rise of cities, many rural ice houses fell into disuse. Urban populations needed faster, more portable solutions, and while large-scale food storage did evolve in cities, root cellars, cool rooms, and deep wine vaults, it lacked the grandeur and novelty of those noble ice palaces buried beneath the hills. Still, in some corners of the world, the tradition persisted. Persian yakhchals continued to cool desert fruit markets. Scandinavian hunters buried seal meat in snow-packed crevices. In the American colonies, George Washington's estate kept an ice house stocked for cider and custards, and in 19th century India, colonial administrators built pukka ice houses using British imported frozen lake ice, all the way from New England. But increasingly, refrigeration left behind the romance of quiet stone vaults and shifted toward speed, steel, and commercial demand. When ice became a commodity. The 19th century ushered in the great ice trade. Before the age of electricity, entrepreneurs in colder climates harvested natural ice in vast quantities, storing it in massive warehouses and shipping it across oceans. Frederick Tudor, the so-called Ice King, built an empire sending frozen Massachusetts lake ice to Cuba, India, and Brazil. Insulated with sawdust and packed tightly in ship holds, his ice survived months at sea. But this wasn't the cold of noble.
What chilled the empire warmed the imagination. So here you are, standing over a stone vault built by people who feared famine more than war. They harvested cold like grain, carried it like spice, measured it like a sacrament, and in doing so they touched the future. A bowl of chilled fruit in 1347 wasn't just dessert. It was the triumph of planning over chaos, of slow, cumulative knowledge over weather, of storing comfort against a season of heat. It's dawn in Istanbul, sometime in the 17th century. The muezzins have just called the faithful to prayer. Street sellers are still silent. But inside a small tiled chamber, tucked beneath the arches of the Topkapi Palace, steam curls gently from dozens of brass pots. You're not in a cafe. You're in the imperial coffee department. Because here, in the heart of one of the world's longest-lasting empires, coffee wasn't just a morning ritual. It was policy.
It was protocol. It was paperwork. Over the centuries, the Ottomans developed a bureaucracy so detailed, so meticulous, and so oddly soothing in its routine that one could say it ran, quite literally, on caffeine. The arrival of the bean, coffee first arrived in the Ottoman Empire around the early 1500s, likely through Sufi circles in Yemen and the Hejaz. At first, it was a curiosity, used for spiritual alertness during long night prayers. Then it became habit, then custom, then law. By the mid-1500s, Istanbul was home to dozens of coffee houses, and with coffee came conversation, poetry, politics, gossip, trade. Some found this alarming, others turned it into structure. Sultans noticed that where coffee gathered, so did ideas, and like anything that gathered power in the Ottoman world, coffee was soon absorbed into the great imperial machine. Thus was born the kahvechibashi, the chief coffee maker. Yes, there was a chief coffee maker. The kahvechibashi wasn't just a royal barista. He was a palace official, an elite eunuch, often serving directly under the chief black eunuch of the harem. His job was to oversee the sourcing, roasting, grinding, brewing, presentation, and timing of the sultan's coffee. And this was no minor post. A poorly timed cup of coffee could result in demotion. A particularly aromatic brew might lead to a promotion. Coffee preparation was treated with ritualistic care, boiled slowly over charcoal, served on filigreed trays, accompanied by sweets and water. The kahvechibashi managed an entire sub-bureau of coffee servers, known as kahvechila, many of whom were trained from youth to handle the etiquette of pouring without offending a nobleman's pride. Some even received written evaluations. Pouring steady, aroma robust, does not chatter unnecessarily. Coffee as empire glue. As the empire expanded, coffee spread with it, down caravan routes, into mosques, up the Danube, across the Mediterranean. But the Ottomans didn't just export beans, they exported protocol. Every provincial governor, vizier, or court bureaucrat who wished to emulate the center learned the etiquette of Ottoman coffee, when to serve it, how to sit, how to lift the cup, how long to pause between sips. Coffee became a unit of imperial cohesion. In short, coffee became something you could file. So as you stand in the cool tiled shadows of the palace kitchen, the scent of cardamom and roasted beans floating in the air, you may pause to wonder, was there ever another empire so devoted to hot beverages that it appointed a man whose entire job was to make sure no one ever spilled anything on a silk rug? You've been summoned to a formal gathering. Not a war council, not a poetry salon, just a small marble chamber lined with cushions and soft lanterns. On the low table before you sit identical porcelain cups, each perched in a filigree holder, each filled with thick, dark Ottoman coffee. They look the same, but don't be fooled. In the Ottoman world, how you drink coffee, and when, is a subtle, high-stakes language. A language of pause lengths, cup order, sweetness levels, and how much foam clings to the rim. To misunderstand it is to misstep in rank, trust, or courtesy. Because by the 17th century, coffee wasn't just a beverage in the empire, it was social architecture. A cup for status, a sip for surveillance. The Ottomans used coffee to gently police hierarchy. In the palace, protocol dictated who received coffee first. The Sultan, naturally, always first. Then the Grand Vizier. Then others by order of proximity to power. Even the kahvechibash's assistants had roles. One stirred, one served, one stood silently in case a drop was spilled and honor had to be repaired. For guests, sweetness mattered. Serving bitter coffee to someone could mean you wished them caution or restraint. Sweet coffee? Warmth, trust, or affection. And if the foam was rich and lingering, It was a sign of respect. Thin or bubbly, you might be on thin ice. Coffee diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned, if you wanted anything in Constantinople, start with the cup. European envoys practiced Ottoman etiquette before visiting court. They rehearsed phrases of thanks, learned to sit without crossing their legs, and memorized sugar conventions. Why? Because a well-received coffee exchange could earn you a trade concession, while a poorly timed slurp could delay negotiations by weeks. The French ambassador once remarked that a single tray of coffee, served with walnut cakes and perfect silence, is worth more than a month of arguing over maps. Even military truces were often toasted with coffee, not wine, not because of religion necessarily, but because coffee signaled refinement, steadiness, and shared ritual. It told your enemy, we both value patience. The Ottoman Coffee Code. The empire even developed private uses for coffee's structure. In homes and harems, women used coffee service as a tool of communication. Young brides were evaluated by their coffee brewing skill. When suitors visited a home, the girl would serve them coffee, sometimes with salt instead of sugar to indicate distaste or unwillingness. A flawlessly brewed cup meant acceptance. A bitter mess meant, politely, no thank you. At court, similar unspoken cues existed. 2 cups placed close together, agreement. 1 cup delayed from a servant, displeasure. A pause after sipping before complimenting, suspicion. In this world,
Meanwhile, in the streets beyond the palace, the empire's famous café coffee houses, were humming with their own form of sleepy revolt. Here, commoners gathered to sip, read poetry, play backgammon, and grumble about taxes. Officials watched closely. Too many grumblers in one corner could mean sedition. So the state kept tabs. Some coffee houses were licensed, others watched. At times, rulers tried to ban coffee entirely, worried it was making people too alert, too social, too resistant. The bans never stuck. People hid coffee pots behind curtains, brewed in secret, and always returned when the sun went down. The empire was built on order, but the coffee houses whispered freedom. So as you gently lift your cup, thick with foam, sweetened just right, not too hot, you might ask, was it possible that coffee was the quietest rebellion of all, served 1 cup at a time under the watchful eyes of the empire that brewed it?
The empire is waning. The maps are shrinking. The borders are restless. The sultans, once lions, now mostly sign papers written by stronger men in languages they do not speak. The army reforms, the treasury withers, and yet, in the courtyard of a modest Ottoman home, an elderly man stirs coffee over charcoal with the same brass spoon his father used. He tips the pot just so, waits for the foam to rise, pours it gently in silence. The empire may be crumbling, but the coffee is still served correctly. An empire held together by ritual. As the 18th and 19th centuries passed, coffee became one of the last stable traditions within the Ottoman world. In a period of dizzying reform, Western clothing, French advisors, railways, printing presses, it was coffee that stayed the same. The Kavachibashi's office, while no longer as powerful, still existed in ceremonial form. Sultans still demanded foam. Viziers still held late-night councils with coffee at the center of the table. In the harems, women still read fortunes from the sediment at the bottom of the cup, spinning tales of lost ships and future husbands.
even when modernization swept through the Topkapi Palace, bringing typewriters, foreign tutors, electric lamps, the small corner kitchen used for brewing coffee was left untouched. Because change could come from the West, but not before coffee was served. The rise of the modern cafe and the fall of the palace pot. By the late 19th century, the humble coffee house was now a cultural institution, gone were the fears of sedition. In their place were debates about modernization, nationalism, and poetry. Istanbul's cafes became second parliaments, where men smoked nargileh, read newspapers aloud, and argued over whether the telegraph was a Western trap or a useful magic. Meanwhile, the old courtly traditions of coffee preparation began to feel antique. The kahvechibashi's ceremonial role was reduced to palace rituals. State dinners featured European wines. Guests expected more than one tiny cup of thick black brew, and yet the coffee lingered at state funerals, at weddings. At the deathbed of Abdul Hamid II, it was said that the only sound in the room was the hiss of the pot and the stir of the spoon. Coffee, after the empire. When the Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922, giving way to the Turkish Republic, the bureaucracy collapsed almost overnight. But no one stopped making coffee. Because while you can abolish a sultan, it's harder to abolish the smell of coffee on a quiet morning. The coffee cup and the memory of power. In the end, the Ottoman coffee bureaucracy wasn't just about caffeine. It was about rhythm, about structure, about the soft, slow tick of imperial life, measured in cups and sips and silence. It trained men to be still, to observe, to pour without arrogance. It taught diplomacy through taste and patience through temperature. And even today, when you sit in a Turkish cafe, hearing the clink of small porcelain cups and the faint rattle of beans in the grinder, you're closer than you think to a world where coffee was an institution, not just a drink, but a ceremony, a job, a language. So as you swirl the grounds at the bottom of your cup and stare into its muddy depths, you might wonder. You sit on a wooden bench, stiff-backed, scratchy wool robe gathered around your knees. It's the year 1104, and you're somewhere in Normandy, or possibly Saxony. It hardly matters. It's early, always early. The bell has just rung for matins. You shuffle forward into the choir stall. Your candle sputters. Psalms begin. And then, from the corner, comes a noise, a snore. Not a loud one, but a definite nasal rumble, followed by the slow collapse of a head against a wooden pillar. A brother has fallen asleep during prayer. Now, in any other community, this might elicit a chuckle, perhaps a nudge, but not here, because here you live under the rule. And under the rule, snoring has consequences. Monastic life in medieval Europe wasn't governed by moods or mood swings. It was governed by the regula. The rule of Saint Benedict and its later variants defined nearly every aspect of monastic behavior. When to sleep, how to eat, how to sit, how to breathe during psalms. Discipline was not a suggestion, it was a framework for spiritual survival. And when that framework cracked, even slightly, the result was not chaos. It was paperwork. Because monks didn't just get punished, they got recorded. Offenses were listed, fines were levied, penances were assigned, and, in the more ambitious monasteries, charts were kept tracking repeat offenders. It was not uncommon for a scribe to note, "Brother Aldrich, second snored during Psalm 118, assign floor mopping and no cheese tomorrow." Sleep at the wrong time, that'll cost you dinner. Falling asleep during prayers, called sloth of the soul, was taken seriously. Not because it was shameful, but because it implied spiritual distraction. The punishment varied. First offense, extra work detail or silent meals. Second offense, sitting in the penitent's stall, a visible sign of shame. Third offense, temporary exclusion from choir altogether. Some monasteries even had snore points systems. Accumulate enough during a season, and you'd be barred from speaking.
Usually the prior or novice master, but in larger houses, a special office called the corrector handled violations. Their job was not just enforcement, but harmony. They noted infractions, assigned penances, and reminded brothers of the goal, not obedience for its own sake, but spiritual quietness. In some abbeys, infractions were read aloud once a week, an early form of group accountability. But forgiveness was always offered. Every infraction came with its built-in path to restoration. And no matter the sin, be it a stolen apple or an inappropriate grin at the abbot's hiccup, there was always a place for return. So, as you return to your psalm, and the snorer is quietly escorted to the far end of the bench, candle still flickering beside him, you may wonder, was the true genius of the monastic world not in the silence of its cloisters, but in the quiet, repetitive ways it taught people how to begin again, even if they snored through Psalm 118.
By the time the second bell rings for lauds, the air in the monastery smells faintly of cold porridge, tallow smoke, and old parchment. Brother Aldrich, having now been publicly reminded of his snoring offense, is dutifully sweeping the West Cloister walk in silence. He does not complain. This is how correction works here. Softly, consistently, and almost boringly. And yet, within these quiet rules lies some of the strangest and gentlest punishments ever devised by organized society. Let's explore. The curious case of the cheese thieves. In a Cistercian abbey in Burgundy, sometime in the early 1200s, a young novice was caught stealing a small piece of hard cheese, intended for feast days only. It was discovered hidden inside the sleeve of his habit. The punishment? 1 week of meals without dairy, 3 days assigned to the garden compost pit, and a required public apology to the cook. It was known as a counterfeast. The notion being that by going without the stolen pleasure, the brother could reflect not only on the act, but on its deeper spiritual implications. Several abbeys even had standardized charts for luxury infractions, cheese being ranked below honey but above garlic. More than once, these violations were written down in beautiful calligraphy. Brother Julian, tempted by curds, now seeks forgiveness in silence and spade. Ink, misconduct, and the scriptoria of shame. In scriptoria, the rooms where monks copied manuscripts, discipline was almost artistic. A poorly illuminated capital letter? That might earn you a day without ink. Spilling ink across a psalm page? You'd be required to scrape the vellum clean with a pumice stone under supervision. Repeated offenses might assign you to parchment stretching duty, a tedious task with cold water and stiff hides, meant to humble. And if your handwriting was found sloppy, you might be reassigned from theology to copying shipping ledgers or grain receipts. In one known case from a monastery in northern Italy, a monk wrote in the margin, "This page is a punishment for my sloth. May my next S look less like a snake."
Cutlery catastrophes and the fork controversy. By the 12th century, a new kind of culinary danger was quietly spreading through Europe: the fork. Considered by many monastic orders to be overly refined, some said effeminate, the fork was forbidden in several monasteries under the rule of simplicity. Brothers were expected to eat with a spoon, knife, and clean hands. In 1132, a visiting friar at a Benedictine house in England was seen using a two-pronged silver fork for figs. The reaction was swift. Though not excommunicated, as some dramatic retellings claim, he was asked to eat the remainder of his meals that week standing up, so that the pride of the fig may not settle in the body. Later entries in the house journal note that fork use was to be reported in writing. This wasn't petty. To the monks, it was symbolic. Simplicity was a muscle, exercised daily through meals, garments, speech, and even cutlery. Walking the line, literal punishment paths. Some monasteries included a narrow garden path, often called the penance walk, which offenders were assigned to walk slowly, hands clasped, for a set number of rounds. It wasn't cruel, it was contemplative. A sort of spiritual treadmill for the soul. Walkers were discouraged from speaking, and were often accompanied by a more senior brother who might ask reflective questions like, "What led you to speak during chapter this morning?" Or, "Do you feel drawn to silence or stillness today?" This was less like detention and more like early spiritual coaching. Discipline wasn't imposed as punishment, it was offered as a pause. The rule as gentle tyrant. At its heart, the monastic rulebook was a strange blend of legal code and bedtime story, meant to soothe the spirit by wrapping life in predictability. The worst punishment rarely involved pain. It involved removal from community. To miss the shared meal, to sit outside the refectory, to eat alone without the psalm. That was the sting. So, as you watch the younger monks rinse turnips in silence, the snoring offender now quietly slicing bread, you may ask yourself, was this really punishment? Or a centuries-long experiment in learning how to live gently with human failure, one cheese theft at a time? The sun is now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cloister walk. The rhythmic tap of a broom against flagstones echoes softly as Brother Aldrich finishes his final lap. He is no longer sweeping as punishment, but simply because the stones have grown dusty again. His quiet penance has turned into a habit, and that, more than any rebuke, is the goal of monastic correction. Not retribution, but transformation. Because here, amid the order of bells and benches, punishment was never truly about justice. It was about rhythm,
restoration, and returning a soul to its place in the choir. The final step being readmitted. Perhaps the most quietly dramatic ritual in the monastery was the act of readmission. The formal return of a brother to full communal life after a period of discipline. This was not done carelessly. It involved a bowed head, a few spoken words of contrition, never loud, sometimes a kiss of peace from the abbot or prior, always the gentle laying of hands. There are accounts from Cluniac monasteries where the entire chapter paused its reading to acknowledge the return of a brother from a long penance. He would take his seat once more, quietly, and the room would breathe in unison again. Punishment that didn't stick. Interestingly, punishments were often adjusted based on a monk's demeanor. If a brother accepted his correction with grace, walking the penance path without complaint, or copying his assigned verses without scribal sulking, he might be restored early. Conversely, if he argued or appeared resentful, he might be quietly assigned additional duties, sweeping behind the refectory, collecting wax drippings, or reciting extra prayers for the souls of the recently departed. These extra tasks were never labeled punishment. They were called remedies. In this way, the rule book functioned not like a rod, but like a tuning fork, designed to bring each individual back into harmony with the group.
Endless pages of quiet law. Throughout medieval Europe, variations on the Benedictine rule multiplied. Each house adapted, refined, and localized its code. There were Carmelite addenda on silence, Carthusian clauses on solitary eating, Cistercian notes on acceptable shoe leather. But the tone remained consistent. Punishment was not cruel. It was structured care, predictable, boring even. The rule existed to make holiness achievable in small, repeatable motions. Bells rang not as alarms but as reminders. Steps taken around a garden were as redemptive as prayers. Silence was as much about kindness as piety. And cheese-related offenses, while strange to us now, were woven into a complex world where even appetite needed a rhythm. The legacy of penitential peace. Though monasteries have faded from the center of modern life, their vision of discipline, slow, boring, and restorative, still lingers in fragments. In quiet classrooms with gentle correction, in therapy rooms where silence heals, in community centers where cleaning a space is part of making amends. And so, as the sun fully dips behind the cloister walls, and the final bell of the day begins its low, even chime, you might look around at the stone, the straw, the candlelight, and wonder, in a world that so often punishes to forget, were these sleepy monasteries some of the only places that punished to remember, to restore, so that no one was ever lost. For long